Good morning, and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be in James chapter 1, starting with verse 19. But as a recap of the last couple of weeks, I'd like to remember that he talked about in the first part of the chapter that he would like for us to recognize the testing that God can do. And the testing brings about growth. It brings about maturity. It helps us in our Christian walk to be more like God, to be more like Christ, and the example that he's given us. The second thing that he talks about is temptation. And the fact that God is not a tempter. He does not have evil in his heart. He does not use evil. So tempting would not be something that he would do. Satan, however, does tempt. And he brings about things into our lives to tempt us, to try to draw us into sin and away from God. But God's desire is for us to have a relationship with him. His desire is for us to get to know him, to love him, to care about him as he loves and cares about us. And so he tests us to bring us into that relationship, to further it, to cause us to grow. In some ways it's growing because of the things that we've done, things that we need to do. He tests us in those areas so that we can grow, so that we can become more like him. But starting in verse 19, he talks about, "My dear brothers, take note of this." I want you to stop and think for a moment. This idea that he's in the middle of a sentence. He's talking about how God does not tempt us, but Satan does. And then he says, now listen to this. Hear me. There's a popular saying among the teens today. It's called, "Listen, Linda." And it's kind of the idea that my son, whenever he was younger, he would walk up to my wife and put his hands on her cheeks and say, "Listen to me, hear me." I think James here is wanting us to hear his message. He wants us to stop whatever we're doing and listen. Pay attention. Hear what he has to say. What could be so important? When you hear the words, "It is time for a real change," what comes to your mind? Maybe a song, "It's time for a real change," or a cool change. Or maybe it's a political statement. It's time for change. Or maybe it's for a business that we're going downhill, we're losing, and it's time to change what we're doing and start turning a profit again. Or maybe it's in our personal lives or the world around us. It's time for us to make a change. I'd like to challenge you this morning that we want to make a change. James is saying, stop, pay attention, listen. It's time for a change. In verse 19 he says, "My dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." This idea of being quick to listen and slow to speak. This is a hard concept for us. I heard one time that if you have two ears and one mouth, that means you should be listening twice as much as you're speaking. But I think most of us have a tendency to speak twice as much as we listen. I think James is trying to remind us that we need to be slow to speak and quick to listen. Why would that be? What would be so important about that? I think that there's this idea that if we could stop and hear the heart of the person that we're speaking to, that maybe we can understand them, that we could help them, maybe encourage them. If nothing else, we show them value. One of the things that I think is missing today in our society is that we don't show value to other people. Oftentimes we devalue them by not doing what we say we're going to do. We don't show up on time. We maybe tell somebody we're going to do something and then we don't do it. Those things are the things that we tend to miss out on sometimes because we've forgotten that we are an example for others. But I want you to think about listening. How often have you been talking to someone and in the middle of your sentence they cut you off to tell you something that they have thought about? Or how often when you are listening to someone else talk, do you stop and you you quit listening because you're thinking about what you're going to reply to and how you're going to respond to this monologue coming at you, and you quit listening to them. But when we want to show value to someone, we listen, we hear what they're saying, and we make a difference in their lives by doing so. On the other hand, what we often do is we will plan ahead of what we're going to say, and then as soon as they stop for breath, we cut in and we give them our opinion about something. And what would happen if you just listened, if you just heard their heart, if you were slow to speak and quick to listen? But he also says, be slow to become angry. He says there in verse 20, for man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. God desires us to be righteous, to be right in His eyes. To be right in His eyes means that in this verse he says, if you want to be righteous, do not be angry with others. Anger is an emotion. It's something that we feel. It's what we do with the anger that becomes right or wrong. When we have an emotion of anger and we respond with anger, then we often will do damage and we hurt others without intending to. But when we stop and we're slow to become angry and we listen to the heart of one that's speaking, what a difference we can make. How much easier it would be to take our foot out of our mouth whenever they're finished speaking. Because if we haven't said it, we don't have anything to work around. But I want you to hear what he says in the next verse. He says, therefore. So therefore means look back and see what it was that he's talking about. What he's talking about is being slow to speak, slow to become angry, and quick to listen. And he says, therefore, get rid of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. I believe what James is saying here is that if we want to live a righteous life, if we want to be quick to listen and slow to be angry and slow to speak, then we are aiming at what God considers to be righteous, His desires for us. And if we have that desire, here's how you accomplish it. He says, stay away from evil. Avoid the moral dilemmas of the world around us and focus on Him. If we want to be like Christ, we want to live a pure life, a righteous life. And he says, be humble. In order for us to understand humility, we have to understand pride. Pride is something that all of us tend to deal with. We want to think about what I want. There's actually two kinds of pride. There's a hidden pride and an obvious pride. The obvious pride is boasting about what we have or what we've done. That's an obvious pride that most of us recognize. But the hidden pride is the one that says, look at me, because I have had damage, hurt, pain, so I want you to see who I am. I want you to be impressed with who I have become or what I have done. And that hidden pride sometimes is easily disguised in the way that we accept or deal with the issues of what we want, what our desires are. But when we have this desire in our heart to listen to others, to hear what they have to say, but also not just what others have to say, but what God has to say. He says, humbly accept the word that is planted in you, which can save you. What word has been planted in us? We talked about a couple of weeks ago the fact that the word is Christ. In John chapter 1, he talks about that Jesus is the Word. And the Word was from the beginning. It is God. That He is God. And so when we allow Jesus into our hearts, when we allow Him to be in control of our lives, when we allow Him to be the king on in the throne of our hearts, then we are allowing him to be the one who rules in our lives. We submit. We resign our own desires, our own will, the moral dilemmas that we face. We allow God to be the one in control instead of us. But going on here in verse 22, it says, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror, and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard, but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does." This picture that's behind me is a picture of a young boy looking in the mirror. And it's like he's pointing out that you need to make some changes. You need to change. I thought that was a pretty good caption for this part. To not just listen to the words, not just hear them, but to apply them, to make them part of our lives, to make changes that would be relevant to the things that you see in the mirror. When you step up to the mirror and you see that you've got a beard and you need to shave, if you walk away and you don't do anything, then nothing has changed. You're still the same person. You haven't made any changes to it. What he's saying is when you see in the mirror that something needs to be fixed, something needs to change it. Do something about it. Don't just continue on the way you are. If you want to make a difference, look at it, listen, hear what needs to happen, and then make changes accordingly. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. That's a tendency. That's a tendency when we wake up in the morning, but it's also a tendency in our everyday life. Because sometimes we see something, someone says something, and it jogs a memory. It makes us think about something that we need to change, something that needs to be different. But then we walk away and we make no changes. Maybe we've heard a preacher, maybe we've read something in the Bible. Maybe somebody has mentioned something to us of things that we need to change. But when we just continue on without changing, we've missed the opportunity that God has given us to make a difference, to change our lives. The next part of the verse, in verse 24, he says, verse 25, "But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard, but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does." When we look at the old law, we see an imperfect law. It wasn't that the law was imperfect, it was the fact that we couldn't uphold it. But the new law, the perfect law, the law of Christ, brings forgiveness. It brings mercy, grace, love, compassion. I want to take just a moment here to explain that I don't believe that this is something different. I believe God has always been a loving God. When you look back at the Old Testament and you see the stories about how he longs for his people to follow him, how he gives them chances over and over again, that he forgives them and accepts them back. If you will only return to me, I will take you back. When we read the book of Hosea, you'll see this story of God's forgiveness, his desire to welcome his children back. That hasn't changed. But the law has changed. The new, the perfect law, based in Jesus Christ, he already paid for our sins. He already made us perfect in the eyes of God. Not because of what we've done, but because of what he has done. We are perfect in his eyes. God has done this so that we would know and understand that he is a loving God and that he wants us to have a relationship with him. And the if we do what he's asked us to do, if we see the things that we need to change, going back to the idea of God testing us, when he tests us, it's not to see whether or not we're strong enough, it's to help us to grow in that relationship. It's to help us become wiser, more disciplined, better servants of Christ, better followers of him. These things are to cause us to grow, to become like him. And so he says in the last part of the verse that he will be blessed in what he does. Who will be blessed? The one who follows Christ. The one who does what he says. When he reads the word, when he hears the instruction, when he is tested and he sees himself in the mirror, don't just walk away. Make the changes necessary to become like him. But let's go on, starting with verse 26. If anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself, and his religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. So I want you to listen to the first part of this again. If anyone considers himself religious, what's he aiming at here? In that day and age, there would have been a people who were considered to be the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious people of the day. And the religious people of the day would fulfill the law to the letter outwardly. It was something that they did to make people believe that they were righteous, that they were holy. And so outwardly, they would look like newly painted fences or clean pots, as he described them. But on the inside, they were dirty, filthy, ugly, because they were just doing it for show. And so he's trying to, I believe James is trying to show us that the idea of being religious is not what we're after. Because we don't want to be religious like those of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But he's calling us to be religious as God would have us to be. And that's why he's contrasting it here. And he says, if he does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, we're going to be talking about this in the next couple of weeks here, the tongue and the danger, the fire, the damage that can be done by the tongue. But today, I just want to mention that it says he deceives himself and his religion is worthless. When we don't keep a tight rein on our tongue, when we're not careful about the things we say, when we are quick to speak instead of quick to listen, oftentimes we can do more damage than we know. And he goes on, he says, religion that God, our Father, accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. If you want to be religious or righteous in the eyes of God, what do we need to do? He says, keep a bridle on your tongue. Don't be so quick to speak. Don't be so quick to become angry. Instead, be slow to speak. Be slow to anger. Quick to listen. What he wants us to do is to hear and be careful of what we say, so that we can be an example, that we can let other people see our light shining. And in order to do that, he says some good things to consider here is to take care of the orphans, to take care of the widows. In other words, instead of being focused about ourselves, in other words, instead of being focused on what we can get or what we can do, focus on what he has done. And be an example by helping those who are in need, those who are maybe less fortunate. And he says, look after the orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. How often are we polluted by the world? How often do we allow the world to corrupt us? And this is where the change comes in. It's time for a change. It's time for a change for me. It's time for a change for all of us. It's time for a change for the world that we know today. It needs to focus back on God. Center our attention back on being like Christ. When we give Him our focus, when we decide to allow Him to be in control of our lives, then we have the ability to let His light shine, to be an example, to be a help for those that need it. God's desire for us, be slow to speak, quick to listen, slow to become angry. Allow Him to change us, to work on us, to make a difference in our lives. If we are not willing to change, then why even look in the mirror to begin with? If we're not willing to grow, to become more like Him, then why are we looking in the mirror? Why are we listening to sermons? Why are we gathering together if it's not for the purpose of learning, growing, changing, becoming more like Him? These things are for us to become like Him. And He's calling us to a higher standard. He's calling us to be like Christ. Loving, kind, forgiving, understanding, gentle, merciful, graceful, full of grace. His desire is for us to be like Christ. I hope you'll consider these things, to take an evaluation, to stand in front of the mirror and ask yourself, what needs to change? But don't just stop there. Make the changes that are necessary to allow God to be the one in control, to allow Him to be the one on the throne of our lives. Thank you all for listening. Have a great day.